His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we are diving into the wild and crazy, tumultuous, prosperous, exuberant, anxiety-ridden, espionage-infused, mushroom cloud-tinted, space-faring, covenant-restricted, patriotic, turbocharged years that erupted on Long Island following World War II, a time you will recognize and a time ably described in a new book by today's very special guests.
Karl Grossman. I'm a professor of journalism at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury, where I teach investigative reporting, and I've practiced it for more than 50 years.
Yes, Christopher Verga. I teach Long Island and New York history at Suffolk Community College, and I'm an author of a few books, World War II, the Long Island Homefront, Civil Rights Movement on Long Island, and this book, Cold War Long Island, with Karl Grossman.
And it's great to both, if you don't recall, you both have been on this show before, so welcome back. It's great to see you working together. And this is out from the History Press. It's out now?
Yes.
Great. So I guess just to set the table, how did the two of you meet? How did you come to write this book together?
Yeah, so I wanted to do a Cold War book on Long Island, which kind of fell in line with my World War II and the Homefront book. And Karl Grossman, he's an institution in Long Island for all his journalism. So I can't write a book about the Cold War era without someone that lived the experiences and reported on it. So that's how we come to collaborate. Karl, you want to add to that?
Yeah, a lot of the issues involved here. For example, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center on Plum Island, just a mile and a half off Long Island, whether biological warfare research has been conducted. This is a story I have covered, I still cover it. Brookhaven National Laboratory, and which is really a product largely of the Cold War in the sense that it grows out of the Manhattan Project, looking for civilian uses and other uses of nuclear technology and its impacts on Long Island and far-off Marshall Islands, where as part of the Cold War, atomic and hydrogen bombs were tested, and Brookhaven Lab medical personnel was sent to the Marshall Islands to monitor the impacts, and quite a scandal, in fact, as to how they monitored the impacts. And these are the kinds of stories I've covered, which are part of our book, Cold War Long Island.
Yeah, and when I think of the post-war years, or what you usually hear about Long Island is the economic boom and prosperity in the 50s, but there are some shocking things in this book if people are not familiar with the Soviet espionage and like you were saying, Karl, the activities of the Brookhaven National Lab and sort of the dark underside of the effects of all this technology and industrial growth. I guess for each of you, what was your big picture takeaway of the time period? I guess, Chris, let me start with you because you did not experience it firsthand. What struck you after researching? What was your takeaway on what the Cold War time meant for Long Island?
Well, at the close of World War II, post-war suburbia, to an extent, there was a lot of optimism. From the foundation of the United Nations right here in Lake Success, the idea of being a global citizen in Long Island, bringing it right here to Long Island, all the way to the idea of just fighting tyranny abroad. And the Cold War just kind of took away that optimism and innocence in a way, because it digressed a direction that we could have went as a country, socially speaking. With civil rights, with the Cold War, you have 17,000 homes in Levittown being built, which all plays into it because this is part of economic expansion during the Cold War on Long Island. But it's going to create generational wealth for many, 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 many coming home soldiers. But it's going to lock out, the African American soldier that wanted those homes. The Cold War is going to initially have bringing it back to Lake Success, the United Nations in Lake Success. And you're going to have all this optimism of Lake Success with the United Nations there. And what's going to happen is the Cold War is going to start on the floor in the United Nations in Lake Success. So we kind of lost our way. We were on the right trajectory. We just veered right versus, staying on the path of the ideals of World War II. And that's the interesting thing about the Cold War. Now, the other interesting thing about the Cold War was you can't take away the idea about the aviation sector and the innovation that was made in the aviation sector that trickled to various divisions of our economy later on, domestic production specifically. So, it's a mixed bag. I think that's the best way to put it, Chris.
Karl, you're doubly important because you lived it as well as covered it and studied it. So does that ring true to you, the contradictions of the Cold War era?
Well, not only have I covered some of these Cold War developments on Long Island as a journalist, and I've been a reporter on Long Island since 1962, but in the 1950s, going to school in Queens, grew up in Queens, we were issued dog tags because of the fear of the Soviets and the United States getting involved in a nuclear exchange. And with dog tags around our necks, seemingly the government would be able to identify the bodies of kids, of school kids. I mean, we did at the school I went to in St. Albans in Queens, did duck and cover. You jumped under the desk in front of you, and sometimes we'd go out in the hall. We were living in the 1950s, and Queens is part of Long Island. Though actually that dog tag project, the City Department of Education was the first entity to distribute dog tags in the United States. They weren't distributed east of Queens in Nassau and Suffolk County, but in Queens they were, and still again, growing up in the 50s, for everybody on Long Island, the specter of the Cold War, a nuclear exchange, nuclear destruction was on our minds. That Dr. Strangelove film, How I Learned to Love the Bomb, was, I think, probably the most representative dramatization of what could have happened. And we'll talk about this later, but it still can happen. The doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been set closer to midnight than it's ever been set since it was created in 1947 because of the concern these days of nuclear war still.
And just to stay on the nuclear weapons aspect, it was so not normalized, but it was so ingrained that I was surprised how many nuclear missiles were stationed on the islands. Could both of you speak to the depth or the what those facilities were like and what those facilities are now? Because I'm envisioning like huge silos deep into the ground outside of Amityville. What was the truth of the nuclear weapons on Long Island?
Well, there were these nuclear-tipped missile bases all over, not only in Amityville. I mean, I did, this was 10 years ago, I did a TV program. People can watch it on YouTube for WWII TV, titled Avoiding Nuclear Destruction by the Skin of Our Teeth. And as I say, it was still avoiding nuclear destruction by the skin of our teeth. And I went to one of these nuclear-tipped missile bases. This was a Nike base. It's just along Route 25, just east of William Floyd Parkway. It's used now as an Army Reserve Center. But what was this missile base, this Nike Hercules missile base, the remnants are still there. I mean, I do what the TV, it's called a standing up on top of a missile silo right in the middle of of Suffolk County in Rocky Point. Those Nike Hercules missiles had short range, and then they had the power, the TNT equivalent power of originally it was 10, then they jumped to 20, and then 30. The Hiroshima bomb, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, that was 13 kilotons. So the idea here was that the nuclear-tipped missiles would be fired from Rocky Point, from Lido Beach, all over Long Island were these missile bases that was set up. And it was at a time that the technology didn't exist for ground-to-air precision missiles. So they couldn't hit a feared Soviet bomber head-on. But the idea would be that they would detonate these, again, enormously powerful nuclear-tipped missiles in the midst of a formation of Soviet bombers and blow the formation apart. And that's how you would stop a formation of bombers heading to bomb New York City. But again, these are short-range missiles, and it depends how the winds would be blowing. But they'd be very close to, if not on top of Long Island when detonated, providing for a nuclear rain, enormous amounts of fallout. Also, in avoiding nuclear destruction by the skin of our teeth, I go to West Hampton, West Hampton, where the remnants of a Beaumark base. The Nike missiles were Army missiles. The Air Force developed its own nuclear-tipped missile, the Beaumark missile. And they didn't have silos. What the Beaumark missiles had, each one was put in a building. And I walked through these buildings and explored these buildings, 56 of them, each with had no longer, thankfully, are the Beaumark missiles there. And neither are the Nike Hercules missiles at Rocky Point and elsewhere. But the buildings, the 50, there's like rows of them, these buildings. And they're used for these days for pre-computer Suffolk County government records, and some are just empty. But I mean, how many people in Amityville, in Rocky Point, in West Hampton, and elsewhere on Long Island knew that next door was a missile base with missiles with the power essentially equivalent, if not more so, than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, ready to be fired. I mean, to this day, our nuclear missiles, whether they're the ICBMs or whatever, are on hair trigger alert. We're standing there, we're ready to be fired from Long Island at, again, what was feared to be formations of Soviet bombers overhead.
No, it's crazy. And Chris, I know you've studied, coming out of World War II, the sort of military-industrial complex. Can you talk about the people that might have been making these weapons for the government and how the switch from the wartime economy, it seemed from my reading that was there sort of a lag between the end of the war and Grumman maybe cutting back production and then finding a new life with all the contracts for the Cold War?
Yes, there was. There was a kind of a pause button on Grumman's and Republic, Fairchild, and all the other big manufacturing subcontractors and aviation plants on Long Island. But, you know, you're going to get like a workforce of about 100,000 people that are going to be putting together these Thunderjet series planes. You got the Thunder Chief in Republic. You have like the F-14 in Grumman's, the Hawkeye, which is still used in military operations. And much later, you're going to have the A-10 Thunderbolt, which is nicknamed the Warthog. And all this stuff is produced on Long Island, and it's going to employ about 100,000 people. This is also going to push. It's also going to push the gross domestic product of the island up higher than many states combined, and it's also going to fund a lot of local schools. And when all these plants close, a lot of local schools are going to struggle to make up for that lost revenue, lost tax revenue. When Republic, Grumman's, all these parent companies and these offshoots, they outsource some of the electrical plants to, like these small shops, when they all close all at once, A lot of schools are going to have to raise the tax revenue on the average homeowner to make up for the lost revenue. And that's probably one of the few reasons why we have such high school taxes here, because the schools had to play catch up. But out of this, you're going to get a lot of innovation as well. You're going to have planes that are going to be doing well over 1,000 miles per hour. You're going to have a plane, the F-14, that's going to use the first microprocessor. There was no microprocessors used before the F-14. That's pretty amazing. So there is going to be a lot of technology that's going to trickle into the civilian markets. It is kind of going to be a double-edged sword because we did get too dependent on them, economically speaking. And when they left, it put us in a very bad situation, economically speaking.
No, and what I like about the work you both did, you don't shy away from complicating. It's not this simple story. This is a lot of talk about the wage issues and worker, union conflicts. So, it was not all cheery like Grumman company town. There was a lot of nuance to how it affected people's lives.
Yes, of course. There was a lot of turbulence for Republic, especially with the labor groups, because Republic, they were living on contract to contract. So they would hire people based on contracts, one government contract. And when that government contract was over, they'll get rid of everyone and hire them back. There was no stability with workers. And once again, you have to have loyalty to your workers. They're the innovation that makes the company work. And that's why Republic is probably going to be one of the first of the big plants to go out of business.
Yeah, and you mentioned the tax base, and what struck me reading through the book was how often that came up, and the role of the local mayors and municipalities. So how, for the both of you, how did the local politicians react to this time? Were they in the loop? Did they know all these things? Were they kind of, did they not know some of the things going on in their own backyard, or how were they trying to navigate the Cold War themselves for their constituents and probably for their own benefit in some ways too?
Well, so for the manufacturing plants, I noticed doing a little research, the first congressional district, Sylvester Wainwright, congressman over there, he was a little skeptical about a lot of it, but he did welcome a Grumman's being expanded there. But he was arguing more for tax base for them. Karl probably reported on this stuff. He's more of a primary source on this.
Yeah, well, it was mainly rah, rah, rah. It was great. We're going to have more income, more money coming in with the Cold War. I recall covering the unveiling of that Warthog plane at Republic. And it was, was this great new fighter plane developed here on Long Island, and how important it'll be. Or with the F-14, I went over to Calverton to the Grumman. Grumman had its operation Bethpage and also in Calverton. And then Congressman Otis Pike, who was a fighter pilot during World War II, he was going to, again, it was a big press event, go up on the F-14, and he did. It was a two-seater plane, so and then he came back and talked about his terrific flight. So there was this strong anti-war movement on Long Island, particularly during the Vietnam War, which I covered. But in terms of Long Island officialdom, it was government officials were rah, rah, rah. We're making money off the Cold War, and let's keep going.
And I want to bring in, I know both of you are interested in the social aspects. So do you want to talk about, with this influx of, say, white veterans coming in one sense? We can talk about Levittown. But socially, what was your take on how the island was developing, how people were living?
Well, with Levittown, this is interesting. I think I detailed this a little bit. Yes, Levittown, you definitely have you have Clause 26, which is definitely preventing a lot of gains of black families into the middle class. And Levitt put that clause in there in later interviews because he said local banks would not process VA loans because of relics of biases that were here from the 20s with Long Island Klan. Which is probably a factor. It doesn't excuse anything, of course. But the other factor of Levittown, besides it being a battleground for civil rights, was that it was a very turbulent place for a kid growing up. Because you have a lot of these soldiers that were coming back from World War II, and mental health, post-traumatic stress, if people are going through some psychiatric issues, it was seen as shameful in 50s America. And I think we know now that post-traumatic stress should be treated, should be talked about, and should be brought to the surface. And we're in a much different place. Or the other factor is, it becomes generational trauma, post-traumatic stress. And you're going to start seeing that a lot in Levittown. You're also going to start seeing an influx of tranquilizers for people living in communities such as Levittown, because a lot of people living in those communities not only are going to have a loved one that probably served in World War II and seen some horrific things, but they're also going to have the anxieties of nuclear Armageddon on a daily basis. Having air raid drills on a daily basis in schools and constant coverage about nuclear armament and having nuclear armament in front of you, it's going to build a certain anxiety of living on the edge. So, behind those closed doors in Levittown was a lot of, mental health issues.
Yeah, and I think, the Stones song Mother's Little Helper is not just a funny line. There was actually a phenomenon of, almost like an opioid crisis of its day, these pills that were marketed to women and others.
Yeah, Milltown. They had some of their biggest consumers right here on Long Island. And they were called, like the Rolling Stones song said, the Mother's Little Helpers, and also referred to as M&Ms, which are very addictive to begin with. And this is like a lost legacy. People forget about this. People forget about when we don't talk about mental health and what happens. People usually try to turn to self-medication, which is definitely not a good thing.
Again, I would also, in terms of civil rights, Chris outlined how Levittown really provided a framework for the kind of racism that exists in housing. I mean, Newsday just 2 years ago did a series, Long Island Divided, about people of color being steered to certain neighborhoods and white people being steered to others. They used reporters. It was an undercover journalistic effort to show this. But still, whether it was the environment or whether it was the war, the Vietnam War, Long Island, it challenged. I mean, it wasn't just a collaborator in the Cold War. It was also a place where particularly the Vietnam War was challenged, and also racism was challenged. I mean, in reaction to Levittown's racist policies, Thomas Romano, and Chris has written extensively on this, put together a development in Amityville, advertising it, promoting it as a place that anybody, despite your color, can purchase a house. This is the United States, after all, said Romano. So this development, I think, is one can point to as Long Island going against the bad, going against racism. And we still have so much work to be done in that regard.
Right. No, we see these repeating themes in history. Karl, I want to switch for you. I know you're both interested in environmental impact. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the major legacies of the Cold War, all this Cold War activity in terms of the environment of Long Island?
Well, the plumes, we're talking about toxic plumes, mentioned before, Grumman, out of Bethpage, affecting the water table on Long Island. And they're talking about years and years and years to try to clean up that plume, or at the Grumman facility in Calverton, same sort of thing. And not only do we have chemical pollution, and Long Island, we're standing upon our sole source of potable water, the water table below our feet. To contaminate it like was done doesn't go away very quickly, and particularly radioactive contamination doesn't go away very quickly. You can't neutralize radionuclides. Well, look at the case of Brookhaven National Laboratory. I mentioned before how, well, during the Manhattan Project, this crash program to build atomic weapons was conducted secretly in laboratories set up all over the United States, Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and so forth. And after the war, they wondered the corporations involved in the Manhattan Project, particularly Westinghouse and General Electric, and the tens of thousands of employees, the scientists, the engineers. Well, what are we going to do next? I mean, they can continue to build nuclear weapons, but you can't sell an atomic bomb even to an ally. What could we do next with nuclear technology to perpetuate this major effort, this crash program of World War II to build atomic weapons? And out of that comes, and it's simultaneous with the Cold War, the creation of a national laboratory to look for things to do with nuclear technology other than producing nuclear weapons. And that was Brookhaven National Laboratory on what was an Army base, Camp Upton, in the middle of Suffolk County. And they looked at using nuclear technology to power airplanes, to power rockets, to use radioactivity to irradiate food so you could eat a strawberry if you wanted to 20 years later, or nuclear power plants. That was a big scheme of Brookhaven Lab, which it was pushing for the government. Indeed, Long Island itself was eyed, and it was a partnership. And this I've covered intimately and wrote a book about this called Power Crazy. Brookhaven Lab with the then Long Island utility, the Long Island Lighting Company, pushed a plan to build 7 to 11 nuclear power plants on Long Island, with Shoreham being the first. I mean, the relationships was intimate between the lab and Lilco. Phyllis Vineyard, the wife of George Vineyard, the director of Brookhaven Lab, she was a paid member of the board of directors of Lilco pushing nuclear. In the last years of Lilco, William Catacasinos, a former assistant director at Brookhaven National Laboratory, was the CEO and chairman of Lilco. And meanwhile, the attitude at Brookhaven Lab in terms of nuclear poisons was not that serious. In fact, in another book I did on nuclear power, Cover Up What You Are Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, I reprint as a facsimile the beginning of the safety manual at Brookhaven National Laboratory, which speaks about radioactivity, asks the question, is radioactivity dangerous? Can be, but doesn't have to be. In any case, with this attitude that nuclear technology, well, it's benign, basically, if used for peaceful purposes. Here at the lab, reactors were built, 3 reactors in total, and the impact done. Tritium, which can get into the water, and it did get into the water under Brookhaven Lab, and then moved towards south, particularly to the community of Shirley. Kelly McMaster's written an excellent book. She teaches at Hofstra about this atomic town, Shirley, not because of nuclear facilities in Shirley, but what was there at Brookhaven Lab. I did a lot of journalism on the polluting of the Peconic River, the major west-east river on Long Island, with poisons from Brookhaven Lab. I'm talking about plutonium and strontium-90 and cesium-137. And I was told, the officials at Brookhaven Lab looked at me and told me, well, they're just there because of fallout from atomic tests in the 50s falling out on Long Island. That's why finally, when this is a while back, 15 years back, when a new sewage plant was proposed at Brookhaven Lab as part of the environmental impact studies that had to be made, there was the admission, no, these poisons of the Peconic River are from us, are from the lab, and a new sewage treatment plant would help deal with this problem. They had lied to me. So the legacy of the Cold War, the legacy of nuclear activities at Brookhaven Lab, they're going to stick with us for a long time.
I'm realizing as we talk, and necessarily so, there's a lot of stress related with this time period and serious effects. And this maybe wasn't the aim of your book, but were there any positive takeaways you would want to put across about this time period, or moments of joy you maybe found in the research as you were looking through all these other problematic things that were happening?
Yeah, well, I like to answer that. Endurance. We came back even stronger as a region. Despite these setbacks, we still come back stronger. Well, when we talk about the environmental crisis that we did have and we still do have, Long Island wrote the book for environmental law. Long Island was the one that cornered the market on it. Environmental law came out from our region. That alone, paves the way for a brighter future for us. And also, we fought civil rights. We fought the civil rights movement here. We had gains in that as well. Some of the best reforms did come from our region. Yeah, we're still a work in progress, but the endurance and the ability for us to adapt as a region, definitely is a strong positive highlight here. And once again, as I said before, the first time we ever used microprocessors in anything was the F-14, and that came out of our region. And, that innovation still is with us in just about everything.
Right, and it's a well-known story of Grumman and the lunar module, so we'll leave people to read that themselves. But that's another high point, I would say, right? The contributing to the moon landing.
Yeah, it's interesting, that segment there. Yeah, definitely.
Karl, just to tap into your experience, what other than being a reporter, what was your life like during this time period? Did it feel oppressive? Were you constantly on edge, or could you enjoy some of the 50s and 60s as you were going through it, or the people around you? What was the tone of your orbit, would you say?
Well, it's frankly, things have not changed with me because I've been a journalist all my working life since I've been 20 years old, based on Long Island. But indeed, one of the things I'm doing after we speak, in fact, I have to get back to it, is a rather extensive piece that I was asked to do about space tourism and whether the move to turn the heavens into a war zone now with the U.S. Space Force, is that going to collide with Bezos and others looking to these billionaires to make space, into a tourism area? When you have a space force, when you have, it goes back to the Reagan Star Wars program, but in fact, it goes back even earlier than the Reagan Star Wars program to what's called Operation Paperclip, when various Nazi scientists, over 1,500, were brought to the United States to help develop technology to deal with our new enemy. We were allies during World War II with the Soviet Union, but now our new enemy, the Soviet Union. And again, the piece I'm going to be finishing in the next day or two has to do with what would occur if these plans move ahead for weaponizing space to space tourism. Frankly, they'd kiss space tourism goodbye. So these are the kind of issues that I've lived with for all my working life. And again, here on Long Island, the Cold War and the new Cold War that we're embarked on, instead of trying to, as we should, settle differences diplomatically, this new Cold War has very much involved Long Island.
Maybe as a way to wrap up a little, or let you bring in some things we might not have talked about, but do each of you, would you want to recommend or talk a person you discovered or through your research, a local name that you think deserves more attention for their impact or for what they did, no matter how big or small? Chris, do you have a favorite character, so to say, from your research, or that you would say is important for people to know today?
Yeah. Well, Victor Yadicone, I think we discussed him in prior podcasts. The guy made environmental law, essentially. His work on the Agent Orange litigation, his work on banning DDT is definitely a name that should not be forgotten here in the region.
Yeah, a name to me, which is very important, is Eric Traub. Just mentioned Operation Paperclip before, these Nazi scientists being brought to the U.S. after World War II, again, largely because of the Cold War. And Traub had actually background here on Long Island. He had been studying at the Rockefeller Institute in the 1930s, was very involved in Nazi activities at Camp Siegfried in Yaphank, which was this Nazi parade grounds for the whole New York metropolitan area. Its Nazi population, the Long Island Railroad would have trains come out for the weekend rallies. The Bund built community around Camp Siegfried with streets, the name of Hitler Street and Goering Street and so forth. In any case, after the war, Traub comes back to the United States, this time through Operation Paperclip. And during the war, he had a little island in the Baltic called Rheims. And its mission was to develop biological warfare to be used against livestock of the Soviet Union. And he went to Camp Dietrich from the 30s and his studies. He knew people, and he was able to convince. An excellent book on this is Lab 257 by Michael Carroll, Lab 257. He was able to convince the folks at Camp Dietrich to set up on an island, kind of like an island he had in the Baltic during the war, a laboratory to develop biological warfare, which could be used against livestock in the Soviet Union. That was 1953, and I began looking into biological warfare and Plum Island a number of years later. It was Newsday, though, which indeed broke the story. John McDonald, an excellent investigative reporter from Newsday. I'm reading from a story that finally came out that John put together. The lead, a 1950s military plan to cripple the Soviet economy by killing horses, cattle, and swine, call for making biological warfare weapons out of exotic animal diseases at Plum Island Laboratory. Now declassified Army records reveal. And Newsday ran, too, a facsimile of an Army order. Plum Island will permit the Chemical Corps to execute required projects in connection with the imported agents, and others might become of biological warfare significance. However, a couple of years later, and Mike Carroll deals with this based on documents he found in the National Archives, how the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that, I'll just quote from Lab 257, that a war with the USSR would best be fought with conventional and nuclear means and biological warfare against humans, not against food animals. Destroying the food supply meant having to feed millions of starving Russians after winning a war. Then the question is, well, was the mission totally changed at Plum Island? Because then there was a transition to a focus on dealing with foreign animal diseases. Well, two other excellent investigative reporters at Newsday, Drew Featherston and John Cummings, they did a piece how in 1971 there was an outbreak of African swine fever in Cuba. And they wrote about how, they connect the dots here, how the container was brought to a U.S. base in what was then the Canal Zone in Central America, in what's now Panama. It was brought by boat to Cuba, delivered to anti-Castro operatives. The only place where the virus was known to have been kept in the U.S. was at the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, and they connect Plum Island, its lab, CIA, and this operation again in the 70s. So I really wonder whether, I've been told by the folks at Plum Island through the years, and I've been there 3 times, and began investigating biological warfare in Plum Island myself in 1970, that we do biological warfare, but only defensive biological warfare. Where is that line between defensive and offensive biological warfare?
Yeah, no, it's chilling, and just to think, we didn't go into all the other aspects. All of this is in the book, Plum Island, Camp Hero, which we didn't touch on. But there's so much that did happen that was covered up or denied that, you don't need extra conspiracy theories because there's so much that was happening that needs to be uncovered. Seems to be a time where almost anything goes in terms of experimentation and national defense and technological development. So we'll leave a lot of that to be discovered by people when they go out and buy Cold War Long Island. Which are the two of you? Are there anything you want to point to? Can people come see you, hear you speak, other places, or do you have plans coming up for anything?
Yeah, well, we've been speaking, Chris and I. A lot of this is webinars, a lot of Zoom presentations, and we're open to more presentations. This information has to get out. Most people weren't aware that there was a nuclear tipped missile base down the block from them living on Long Island in the 60s. And they only closed these places in the early 70s. And truth is so important. Let's get the truth out. And as I say, we're still so close to nuclear destruction, but we've avoided it by the skin of our teeth, mostly by luck. And just let me add just a couple of minutes. I've been talking about Brookhaven Lab and its creation and its connection to a push to nuclear power on Long Island. And just briefly, I talked about the Marshall Islands. Marshall Islands, that's far away from us. But Long Island and Brookhaven Lab had a big effect on the people of the Marshall Islands. Brookhaven Lab, where again, nuclear is seen as the best thing to come along since sliced bread, its medical personnel were assigned to go to the Marshall Islands, way out in the Pacific, to be involved with the people of the Marshall Islands after the U.S. exploded over 60 atomic and hydrogen bombs. And an important name here, too, is Glenn Alcalay. He was a Peace Corps worker in the Marshall Islands. He's now a professor of anthropology. And he was involved deeply, and we talk about this in the book at length, with the Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal. And he interviewed Marshallese, and I quote from his research, lines like, and I name the person, a Marshallese, I believe the Brookhaven National Laboratory doctors came to study us, not to help us. What Glenn told me himself, it was a secret human radiation experiment before my eyes with a key role played by Brookhaven National Laboratory. Other quotes from Marshallese, they came to study us like animals in an experiment. Finally, there was a $1 billion settlement arranged in connection with the Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal. But $1 billion doesn't pay for the loss of life, the cancers caused by the United States setting off these weapons right off the shores of the Marshall Islands, and then sending medical personnel from Brookhaven National Laboratory to monitor the situation, medical personnel who clearly didn't regard radioactivity as what it is, lethal, and considered the victims there on the Marshall Islands as guinea pigs.
There's definitely a legacy to reckon with. And Chris, just to let you have the last word, anything you want to say to wrap up, or in terms of future plans, or just as someone who studies Long Island history as much as you've done in so many different areas, where do you see the Cold War era in terms of defining Long Island?
Well, it definitely defined Long Island on testing our endurance. And also it defined us on some of the laws and regulations we have with environmentalism. Let me give you an example. New York State put a kind of like an environmental Bill of Rights in the state law. It's very open-ended. It's not as detailed as the Suffolk County Environmental Bill of Rights, but it was passed with both parties with no objection. It was put on a ballot, and it was overwhelmingly voted on, especially from our region, because, people are learning hopefully are learning some of the lessons of the importance of the environment and the fragile balance we have with it.
No, it is definitely a complex picture, and it's not, Karl, we were talking a little earlier, the Cold War Long Island is not just a Billy Joel song. There is depth and nuance to it, and a lot of lessons still to be learned. So I want to thank you both for writing the book, doing the research. It's a great addition to anyone's library, and thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you again to Karl and to Christopher for unpacking just some of the details included in their new book that is Cold War Long Island from the History Press, out now. Make sure you get your copy. As we mentioned, there's more than we even got to. So the story of Camp Hero, what's actually under those buildings, more on Plum Island, more about the Soviet spies that were acting on Long Island. There are some train stations you'll never look at the same way again. And we also have links in our show notes to related resources and places you can get many of the books we mentioned on the episode. Our show notes are at longislandhistoryproject.org. Hope you enjoyed that episode and that you are primed for the new year and new episodes. All we ask is that you share us with a friend. If you went to school in the 50s and you remember Duck and Cover, send this episode to your Facebook group. Share it with the people online with you for gas at Costco. Let them know that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. That does it for this episode, our first of the new year, so Happy New Year. And as always, thank you for listening.